بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته حياكم الله. Welcome back, brothers and sisters, to our second to last class in the Tuhfatul Atfal course. Last week, alhamdulillah, we had completed the section on Ahkam al-Lam as-Sakina, and also the ahkam for idgham al-harfayn al-mutamathilayn wal-mutaqaribayn wal-mutajanisayn. Inshallah, this week in our second to last class, we'll be covering approximately half of the last chapter, which is perhaps the longest chapter in the whole poem, which is the chapter of Mad, Bab al-Mad. So we'll be breaking it up into two classes. This class today, and then next week's class, we will finish off the chapter of Mad and conclude the poem, insha'Allah azza wa jal. So to begin today's class, we will start off with Aqsam al-Mad, with verse 35 of the poem. قال الشيخ رحمه الله تعالى أقسام المد, the divisions of Mad. He starts off by saying in verse 35, وَالْمَدُّ أَصْلِيٌّ وَفَرْعِيٌّ لَهُ وَسَمِّ أَوَّلًا طَبِيعِيًّا وَهُ. So the Shaykh starts off by telling us that Mad, the process of stretching and elongating vowels, is broken into two divisions. There's two parts to it. There's qisman to Mad. The first one he calls Asli, al-Maddul Asli, original Mad. And the second part he calls Far'i. We will translate Far'i here as secondary Mad, Mad that is derived or is comes out of Mad Asli. It's a Far' minhu, it's a division of it. We will translate it as secondary Mad. Then he says, وَسَمِّ أَوَّلًا طَبِيعِيًّا, and name this first type of Mad, Mad Asli. You can also call it Mad Tabi'i, or natural Mad, Mad Tabi'i. And then he goes on to define what Mad Tabi'i is, and he says, وَهُ مَا لَا تَوَقُّفٌ لَهُ عَلَى سَبَبٍ. There is no reason causing this Mad. Yani this Mad is intrinsic. It will always be there. It is not waiting for a reason to appear. وَلَا بِدُونِهِ الْحُرُوفُ تُجْتَلَبْ. And without this type of Mad, you would not be able to pronounce the letters. You cannot bring forth the letters of the alphabet, such as Qaf, Ta, Ha, Ra, right? All these letters, when I just pronounce them, this natural elongation I'm doing, that's the natural Mad in them. If I didn't pronounce them with Mad, they wouldn't come out. I would just say Qa, Ta, Ra, right? I have to stretch them. Qaf, Ta, Ra, and so on. And then he further defines what Mad Tabi'i is by saying, بل أي حرف غير همز أو سكون جاء بعد مد فالطبيعي يكون. Any letter that appears after, or any letter that is not a hamza and is not a sukun, if it appears after a letter of Mad, then that Mad is going to be tabi'i. In other words, Mad tabi'i is any type of Mad that does not have a Hamza or Sukun after it, as we will explain further in a little bit. And then he mentions the second type of Mad, by saying, وَالْآخَرُ الْفَرْعِيُّ مَوْقُوفٌ عَلَى. The second type of Mad, Far'i, is reliant upon or is waiting for a reason. Ala sabab, it's waiting for a reason to be stretched beyond its natural length. Kahamzin aw sukunin musjala, such as hamza or sukun. Yani the two things that will cause Mad Far'i, that will cause the Mad Tabi'i to be stretched and become Mad Far'i, is a hamza or a sukun musjala in general. And there are some exceptions. You have other types of Mad that are not caused by Hamza or Sukun, but those are not part of our explanation in this class. Now, So then the Sheikh, or then we will explain what the Sheikh means by these terms. So first thing, med in Arabic, the word med means to literally stretch something. Like when Allah says, "Wal arda madadnaha," we stretched forth the earth, right? It means to stretch or lengthen something. And there are two types of med: original, which we said is called med asli, and then we also called it med tabi'i, natural med, intrinsic in a word, and then secondary med, med far'i. So natural med refers to that med which is intrinsic and is never stretched beyond its normal length of two haraka. And we'll explain what two haraka is just now, but we do not stretch natural med beyond these two haraka. Secondary med is med that is caused by a secondary object, such as hamza or sukun, and this med is stretched beyond the natural limit or the normal limit of two haraka. So natural med, as we said, is any time I have one of the three letters of med, alif, waw, or ya, and the letter after them in general is not a hamza or a sukun. The letter after the alif or the waw or the ya is not a hamza or sukun. So there's no secondary object acting on this med, so it will only ever be two haraka. And as we said before, mad tabi'i is also referred to as the one that is necessary to pronounce the letters of the alphabet, like qaf, see the alif, noon, see the waw, sin, see the ya. The length I've stretched these letters in the middle is the length of natural mad. And if I remove the mad, then these letters would not be correct. I would say qaf, nun, sin, right? So here's what here's what natural mad looks like. So if I have the word قالوا يا موسى, every letter of med here is only ever being stretched for its natural length because there's no reason to go beyond that. I don't say قالوا يا موسى. لا, هذا خطأ. There's no reason to stretch it. And what is a haraka? A haraka is basically one fatha or one dhamma or one kasra. So qa, lu, right? And then two haraka, that's the length of med. So if I said ba, ba, or bu, bu, or bi, bi, that would be the same length as ba, 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 bu, 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 bi, 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 right? When I say mad tabi'i, it's referring to this natural length of two haraka. And then mad far'i, secondary mad, is whenever I have one of the three letters of mad, alif, waw, or ya, and then there is a hamza or sukun that appears after them, either in the next word or in the same word. And in the case of mad badal, which we'll talk about later today, it could also be that the hamza appears before the letter of mad as well. So because of these secondary objects, hamza or sukun, I can stretch the med for more than two haraka. I can stretch it for four haraka or for six haraka even, according to the qira'ah that I'm reading with. And this type of med can appear in one word or two words. And the difference is that whereas mad tabi'i, natural med, will always be there, mad far'i, sometimes it can be there, or I have the option of not elongating it beyond its natural length. Then the Sheikh goes on in the next section to explain what the conditions are for a letter of med to be a letter of med. So he says in verse 39, حُرُوفُهُ ثَلَاثَةٌ فَعِيهَا. The letters of med, yani حُرُوفُهُ, referring to med, are three. So memorize them or know them. مِنْ لَفْظِ وَايٍ. From the expression وَايٍ, this is a noun. The letters waw, alif, and ya. These are the only letters of med in the Arabic language. Waw, alif, ya. Then he explains their conditions with the next term when he says وَهْيَ فِي نُوحِيهَا. And this word is very important because it shows us what the conditions are for each letter of med. So the first letter here, nu, is the waw, and before it is dhamma. The second part, hi, is ya, and before it is kasra. And the last part is ha, I have alif, and before it is fatha. And he explains that here when he says in verse 40, وَالْكَسْرُ قَبْلَ الْيَا وَقَبْلَ الْوَاوِ ضَمْ شَرْطٌ. he says kasra before the ya, and وقبل الواو ضم, and dhamma before the waw is a shart, is a condition, meaning the ya has to have sukoon and before it the letter has kasra. Waw has to have sukoon and before it the letter has dhamma. That's the condition for it to be a letter of mad. وفتح قبل ألف يلتزم, and alif will always have fatha before it, because it's impossible for fatha to have anything, or it's impossible for fatha to ever be anything other than sukoon with fatha before it. The condition or the case of alif is that it always has sukoon and always has fatha before it. And then he mentions a different condition for the waw and the ya, specifically in verse 41, where he says, وَاللِّينُ مِنْهَا الْيَاءُ وَوَاوٌ سُكِّينَا إِنْ انْفِتَاحٌ قَبْلَ كُلٍّ أُعْلِينَا. Lean, so they're no longer a letter of mad, now they're just a letter of lean, is when I have the waw or the ya with sukoon in infitahun qabla kullin, and there's fatha on the letter before them, like in the word aw or ay. There the waw and the ya have sukoon and the letter before them has fatha, right? And that means they're no longer a letter of mad, now they are just a letter of lean. So again, just recapping this, 3 letters of mad in the Arabic language, alif, waw, and ya. The conditions are laid out in the word nuhiha, nu, waw with sukoon, fatha before it. Hi, ya with sukoon, kasra before it. Ha, alif with sukoon, and fatha will always be before it. So we say the letters of mad have sukoon, and the letter before them has the appropriate corresponding vowel. So dhamma for waw, kasra for ya, fatha for alif. And in this state, when they meet this condition of nuhiha, we refer to them as the letters of mad and leen, huruf al-mad wal-leen. But if the ya or the waw, instead of having dhamma or kasra before them appropriately, if they have fatha before them, then they are only a letter of leen, not a letter of mad anymore. And then if the waw or the ya have a haraka on them, like wa or ya, then they're just a harf illa, they're not a letter of mad or a letter of leen anymore. So here are some examples of harf al-leen, like in the word qawl, yawm, quraish, wal-layl. Here the waw and the ya have fatha or have a sukoon on top of them, and then fatha on the letter before them, making them just a letter of leen. So now that we know what the conditions are for each of the letters of mad, what makes them a letter of mad, now we're going to go on to the different categories of mad far'i. So the Shaykh begins by saying ahkamul mad, the rules of mad. He says in verse 42, للمد أحكام ثلاثة تدوم. For the mad, there are 3 rules that are always there. No, there are 3 rules that are always existing for the mad. What are these 3 rules? وهي الوجوب والجواز واللزوم. These 3 rules, or these 3 ahkam, will be wujub, meaning it's obligatory, والجواز, acceptable or optional, واللزوم, necessary, meaning luzum, it will always be there. So al-mad al-wajib, the first one he mentions, is when I have a secondary object, such as the hamza or the sukoon. It exists alongside the mad, either before or after, as we'll see. And performing mad here is obligatory. Yani all of the reciters agree you have to do mad here. But there's variety in how long you have to stretch this mad. Some of them say 3 haraka, 4 haraka, 5 haraka, 6 haraka, and so on. But the point is they agree you stretch it beyond its natural length of 2. The second type we said is al-mad al-jaiz, which is where a secondary object exists, such as hamza or sukoon, but the qurra differ. So some of them say you should do mad, and some of them say no, you don't have to do any mad. You can just keep it at its natural length of mad. It's mad tabi'i level. So we call this optional, mad jaiz. And then the final one that Sheikh Jamzuri mentioned is al-mad al-lazim. We'll call this necessary mad. And this is where a secondary object exists, and the length of stretching the mad is generally agreed upon. Generally, we say it's 6 harakat for mad al-lazim. All the Qurra agree that you stretch this mad for 6 harakat. So now the Shaykh will mention the first category when he talked about wujub, obligatory mad. So he says, فواجب إن جاء همز بعد مد. Wajib mad, obligatory mad, is if hamza appears after the letter of mad. If I have a letter of mad and then immediately after it is a hamza, fi kilmatin, in the same word. So I have a letter of mad and then after it is a hamza in the same word. And what do we call this type of mad? وَذَا بِمُتَّصِلْ يُعَدْ. This mad is called mad muttasil when the hamza is in the same word as the letter of mad. So muttasil in Arabic means joined, something joined to something else. Whenever one of the letters of mad, u, or e is followed by a hamza in the same word, it will be elongated beyond its natural length. And this type of mad is obligatory because all of the Qurra agree that you have to do mad here. There is no qari who, for example, will say وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا بِأَيْدٍ. They will all stretch it وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَاهَا because the hamza is in the same word as the letter of mad. And in our qira'ah, the riwayah of Hafs an Asim min Shatibiyya, from the root of Shatibiyya, which is the recitation of the majority of Muslims, we say that this type of mad will be elongated for 4 harakat. And there is variation in how long or how short this mad is, but for Hafs from Shatibiyya, we say we will stretch this mad for 4 harakat. So here are some examples. وَجَاءَكُمُ النَّذِيرُ. I have alif, and right after it in the same word is the hamza. جَاءَكُمُ النَّذِيرُ. Another example. سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ. I have waw, dhamma before it, sukoon on top, and then in the same word is the hamza. Stretch it for 4 harakat. سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ. Then the last example. سِيءَ بِهِمْ. Ya with sukoon, there's kasra before it, and then hamza in the same word. Stretch it for 4 harakat. This is mad wajib. Mad wajib muttasil. Now we go on to the second type of mad, al-mad al-jaiz, or the first type of mad al-jaiz, because there's 3 different types as we'll see. And the Shaykh says, وَجَائِزٌ مَدٌّ وَقَصْرٌ إِنْ فُصِلْ. So he says mad jaiz is where mad and qasr is yani jaiz. He says you can do mad or you can do qasr. Qasr means when you just recite the letter of mad with mad tabi'i, natural mad. You don't stretch it beyond its natural length. In fusil, yani if the hamza is separate from the letter of mad. What does he mean by that? Kullun bi kilmatin, meaning the hamza is in the next word. It's not in the same word as the letter of mad. So the letter of mad is the last letter of one word, and the hamza is the first letter in the next word. And what do we call this type of mad? وَهَذَا الْمُنْفَصِلِ. We call this mad munfasil. So the word munfasil in Arabic means separated. So in this case, whenever I have a letter of mad, u, e, and it's followed by a hamza in the next word, it's permissible to elongate this mad beyond its natural length. Right? This is al-mad al-jaiz. And this type of mad will only occur when I'm joining to the next word. Right? So if I have a word like la a'budu ma ta'budun, I have the word la, then the word a'budu, hamza at the beginning. If I just stop on the word la, I'm not going to say la, no, because then there's no more hamza. But when I join it to the next word, then the hamza is there. So now the mad shows up. La a'budu ma ta'budun. And again, for our qira'ah of Hafs from the root of Shatibiyya, which is again the recitation of the majority of Muslims, we only read for 4 harakat. We only read for 4 harakat. Now, So let's look at some examples of mad munfasil. So here we have the word bima unzil. I have alif and then hamza becomes bima unzil. I have the word qalu amanna, qalu amanna, right? This alif here, you guys are saying after all, this is called alif al-fasl. It's just meant to indicate that this waw is waw al-jama'a. It's not recited in the word. It doesn't affect the hamza that comes after the waw. And then the last example, وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ. I stretch the ya because of the hamza after it. But again, this only applies if I'm joining. So if I just stopped and said قَالُوا, I wouldn't say قَالُوا. Why? Because if I stop, it's like the hamza isn't there anymore. Only when I'm joining, then the hamza shows up again and it becomes med. I'll just give you guys a demonstration of the difference between the Qurra. So here's the Tajweed Mus'haf for Hafs, Surah Kafirun. We have the word قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ. This is mad munfasil because even though this is written as one word in the Quran, it's actually two words. So you have to pay attention whether a word is written as one word or two, or if it's actually one or two words written as one word, like in the word هَؤُلَاءِ. Ha is one word, ula'i is another word. Also here, ya ayyuha, ya is one word, ayyuha is another word. But they write it as one word as is just tradition to do that. But we still treat it as mad munfasil. And then also here's another mad munfasil, la a'budu ma ta'budun, alif, and then hamza, the next word. Same thing here, wala antum, same thing here, ma a'bud, wala ana abidum, and so on. So you see in the Tajweed Mus'haf, they mark these mad munfasil with red to make it easier for you. And they also put the med symbol on top, this wavy line, which means med, or is the word med, but then over time it became this wavy line to indicate med. But then if I go to the Tajweed Mus'haf for Qalun, see there's no more med. There's no more med on top of la a'budu, wa la antum, ma a'bud, wa la ana. Right? Because Qalun in one of his options, Imam Qalun al-Nafi', one of his options, he reads with Qasr al-Munfasil. He reads with natural mad of Munfasil. So he would just say, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. Right? So in this Mus'haf, they don't put any mad, they don't color anything in because his option is to recite without med, and that's how we call it med jaiz. It's optional to do it or not do it. But for our route of Hafs, as we said, we treat it like it's obligatory because we follow the route of Shatibiya, and then in the route of Shatibiya, med munfasil is always recited with med. Now we go on to the second type of med jaiz. The Sheikh says, وَمِثْلُ ذَا, and similar or like that, mad jaiz for mad munfasil, in عَرَضَ السُّكُونُ. If the sukun is temporary, it's not original. It's just appearing because of some alternative reason. It's not part of the word itself. And he says waqfan, if the sukun appears because of stopping, and for other reasons as well, but he just mentioned stopping. And he gives you two examples. كَتَعْلَمُونَ نَسْتَعِينُ. So what does he mean by this? If I have the word ta'lamun, I have a waw here and a dhamma, ta'lamu, and then a noon with fatha. But if I stop on this word, waqfan, I stop, then this fatha gets turned into a sukun. So now I have a letter of mad and after it is sukun. And that's going to allow me to stretch the oo for longer than the natural period or the natural length of two haraka. Same thing with the word nasta'een. I have ya and then kasra before it. If I stop on this word, this dhamma becomes sukun, and then I can stretch this ya beyond its natural length. So al-mad al-'arid lis-sukun means that the mad is exposed to a sukun. So whenever a letter of mad, a, u, e, is followed by a non-original sukun, such as when stopping on the end of a word, The letter of med can be elongated beyond its natural length, and this is also med jaiz, permissible. You don't have to do it, you have the option of doing it. And as a matter of fact, all of the qurra, all of the reciters have this option. If you stop on a letter with where you stop on a word and then the sukoon appears because you stopped on that word. And this type of med can appear when stopping or also when doing idgham. It doesn't appear in our qira, but in qira such as Abu Amr and Yaqub, when they do idgham, because a sukoon appears, they also have the option of reading with med or with no med. And the general three options when stopping on the word like this, you can read with 2 haraka, which is called qasr or mad tabi'i. You can read with 4 haraka or with 6 haraka. So examples, here we have the Tajweed Mushaf again. For those of you wondering why at the end of verses, they will color the letter of med orange, that's to indicate to you that you have the option of stretching this beyond its natural length, al-mad al-jaiz. So I have ya and kasra before it, and then the word, the noon here with kasra, but if I stop, the sukoon comes on top. So I can say, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ, natural, 2 haraka, or biddeen, 4 haraka, or biddeen, 6 haraka. Right, this is an acceptable length of med. And in general, the qurra say that if you stretch one of your med arid for a certain length, then try to keep it consistent throughout the recitation. It's not obligatory, but it's good to keep your length of med consistent as you're reciting. Also here in the word sahun, same thing, I have waw, dhamma before it. If I stop, I can say sahun or sahun or sahun and stretch it for 6 haraka. Now we will come to the last type of mad al-jaiz, we will say, permissible med, which is one of the more complex types because it doesn't really apply to everyone. And the Shaykh says, أو قدم الهمز على المد وذا بدل. He says, or the hamza will appear before the letter of med. So when we looked at the med muttasil and the med munfasil, the hamza was coming after the letter of med. I had the letter of med and then the hamza appeared in the same order in the next word. But in this case, the hamza appears first, then the letter of med shows up. And we call this type of med badal. We'll explain why just now. And he gives you 2 examples, like amanu, ka'amanu wa imanan khudha, like in the word amanu and in the word iman. So in the word amanu, although it's not written as a hamza, there's a hamza and there's an alif. So I get amanu. And in the word iman, you have the hamza, then you have ya, iman, right? So the word badal in Arabic means to change something. And what is it referring to when we say we are changing something? So whenever I have a hamza with sukoon in Arabic, and the letter before it is a hamza with a vowel, I'm going to change that hamza with sukoon into a letter of mad that corresponds to the vowel on the hamza before it. So if I have like the word it, I have hamza with kasra, then hamza with sukoon after it. I have it will become e. If I have a, it will become a. If I have u, it will become u, right? And the Arabs do this badal, to ease pronunciation of words, because it's easier to switch the hamza, to change it into a letter of med, than it is to pronounce the hamza with a sukoon. So every letter of med that appears after a hamza, immediately after a hamza, will be defined as med badal. And this type of med is only elongated for 2 haraka in the qira'ah of Asim, and the riwayah of Hafs, the one that the majority of Muslims recite in. It's only considered a natural med, 2 haraka. So here are some examples of med badal happening. If I have the word adam, sukoon, and then hamza before it with fatha, it will become adam. If I have the word utu, it will become utu. If I have the word i'manan, it will become imanan, right? Again, this is done to ease pronunciation, and that's what the badal is referring to. It refers to me changing this hamza into a letter of mad. And as we said in virtually every single qira'ah, we will only recite these for two haraka. I will not say oo, two, or imanan, or adam, right? But there is one qari who we'll talk about just now. Here are some examples. Amanu, utu, imanan, al-Qur'an, yura'una, al-khati'in, ra'a, waja'u. So this first alif is mad muttasil, mad and then hamza. But the second part, is mad badal, because I have the hamza, then the letter of mad. Same thing here, aba'i. This first one is mad badal, this second one is mad muttasil, and this last one is mad badal as well. So as we said, all of the qura will recite this with only two harakat. They will not go beyond that, but there is one qari who is Imam Warsh, specifically from his riwayah of Al-Azraq, and only Al-Azraq. None of his other turuq do this, where he stretches the mad badal beyond its natural length. And if you ever go on YouTube and you search up some Moroccan reciters like Sheikh Hisham Al-Harraz, you'll hear them recite with this elongation. So for example, he would read this ayah as وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ آمِنُوا كَمَا آمَنَ النَّاسُ قَالُوا أَنُؤْمِنُ كَمَا آمَنَ السُّفَهَاءُ. So you see, he stretched all these. Aman, aminu, aman again. Also here, if we read this ayah, وَإِذَا لَقُوا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قَالُوا آمَنَّا. And any other examples that appear in the Quran as well, where I have either u or e or a, he will stretch them as an option beyond its natural length of two. He can read without stretching. He can just say aman and iman and utu, for example. And then his other options are to stretch it for 4 haraka or to stretch it for 6 haraka. But again, this only applies to Imam Warsh from his Azraq route, and none of the other Qurra ever stretch this beyond 2 haraka. طيب, and now we come to the last section for today, which will not go into detail. That's because next week's class, the last class, will go into more detail on this when we conclude the poem. So we're just going to touch on it briefly right now. So in this last part, the Shaykh says, وَلَازِمٌ, the necessary mad, right? So we covered wajib, we covered jaiz, now we're covering lazim. إِنِ السُّكُونُ أُصِّلَ, if the sukoon is original, right? Remember we said in mad a'arud lis-sukoon, that sukoon was not original. But in mad lazim, the sukoon that appears after the letter of mad, if it's original, yani it's part of the word, it doesn't disappear. Waslan wa waqfan, yani when joining and when stopping. Right? Just to clarify what original means, meaning whether you're joining the word or you're stopping the word, the sukoon will always be there. بعد مد طويل, after the letter of mad it appears, طويل, stretch it. This mad will be stretched, right? The Qurra all agree to stretch this, and in general they agree that you have to stretch it for 6 harakat, the longest you can stretch it. They also say 6 harakat is the equivalent of 3 alifs in length. So again, we said the mad lazim, we have a letter of mad followed by an original sukoon in the same word. For the qira of Hafs, at least, outside of that you may find some discrepancy. The letter of mad will be elongated beyond its natural length, and we call this mad lazim. And this type of mad is always elongated for 6 harakat, for 6 harakat, or 3 alifs, we said. طيب. Just an important point to note, when we say sukoon, it can be a plain sukoon by itself. And when I look at the word, I can see a sukoon, or that sukoon can be part of a shadda, right? It can be part of a letter that is mushaddad. And that's because every letter that has shadda is actually composed of two letters. The first letter has sukoon and the second letter has the haraka, and together they make one letter with shadda. So the sukoon that appears after the letter of mad that causes mad lazim can either be a plain sukoon or it can be part of a letter of shadda or a harf mushaddad. So we'll look at some examples here and end off inshallah. So I have the word as-sakha, right? I have an alif, and then right after the alif, I have kha with shadda. And we said inside the letter of shadda, there's a sukoon. So that's what's causing me to stretch this for 6 harakat. Sakha. Same thing with the very famous end of Surah Fatiha, wala dhalleen. I have alif, and after it is a lam with shadda. And inside that shadda, there's a sukoon, which means it's original, and I have to stretch it for 3 alifs or 3 times the length of natural mad and say wala dhalleen, right? Same thing here. I have 2 shaddas appearing with 2 letters of mad here. Atuhajjuni, right? I have the of the word atuha, and then I have dream with shadda, and there's a sukoon inside that shadda. Then I have the wow, and after it is a noon with shadda. Inside that noon is also a sukoon. In both of these letters with shadda, there is a sukoon. So I stretch the atuha, and I stretch the atuhajjuni. And then here's an example without shadda, and in the qira of Hafs, this is the only, or the riwayah of Hafs and Asim, this is the only example where I have a plain sukoon in a word. I have the word al-ana. I have alif here, alif maddiya, and then after it is a sukoon on the lam, right? It's an original sukoon, it doesn't disappear, so I stretch this alif for 6 harakat. Al-an. Now, so this week we're not going into detail. Next week, inshallah, we'll cover mad lazim in all of its different categories and divisions in much more detail, inshallah azza wa jal. So to conclude, alhamdulillah, this week we finished 1/2 of the mad chapter. Again, to recap, we had finished tanween and noon at the beginning of the poem, verses 6 to 16. Then the rule of noon and mim al-mushaddadatain. Then al-mim as-sakina. Then al-lam as-sakina. And then idgham of the mutamathilain, mutaqaribain, and mutajanisain letters. And then this week we finished up to verse 57, 35 to 57, where we looked at what the conditions for the letters of mad are, for the a, u, and the e, and then the ahkam of the mad, the rules of wujub, al-mad al-wajib, the rules of jawaz, al-mad al-jaiz, and the rule of luzum, al-mad al-lazim, and why that, or what the cause of that mad is when I'm reading those letters and when reading those words. So inshallah azza wa jal, next week will be our last week where we will finish ahkam al-mad al-lazim, as well as end off the poem bi-idhnillahi azza wa jal. Wa jazakumullahu kulla khair.